Hi everyone, thank you for listening into the Virtual Learning Labs. The Virtual Learning Labs, or the VLL, are a series of open access curated conversations that are aimed at tackling some of the upcoming areas of interest in the development sector. The current focus of our discussions in the VLL have been around data readiness, and I have been in conversation with my colleague Raghav Raheja to talk a little bit more about what does data readiness really mean for organizations in the non-profit sector. The discourse around data and data driven decision making in the social impact space is growing by the minute. And data related considerations are so important for organizations to accelerate their impact. So, my final question for our series on data readiness is how can organizations really become data ready? And Raghav, do you have any tips or actionable insights for organizations and for our nonprofits who are listening in?
Yeah, so we at Social Lens have been, playing around with this idea or basically the framework around realizing the readiness code of an organization. And in this framework, again, I'll go back to the top-down approach, right? Following across what is the goal of the organization? Is that goal specifically defined within the organization? Because see, if you have to show certain sort of impact, right? What is that impact going to look like? And if you don't have that goal set, you don't know what you're capturing, you don't know what you are representing to the outside world. And that's why it's very difficult to have that goal. Now, the second part of it is understanding what is the objective, right? What are those objectives that would feed into my goal, right? If I am doing some sort of work in livelihood, so I will have multiple activities. I will have objectives ranging towards increasing the livelihood towards of certain sect of people. I will have objectives toward, reducing. Uh, I don't know. I mean, you can set up your objective based on the goals of the organization. So defining those objectives. And once you have those objectives in place, then defining the data design. And in data design, I don't mean, creating the databases or creating, technical charts and all of that. What I mean by data design is defining what all data points do you need to capture those objectives, to capture how your objectives are moving towards your goal, right? So in that aspect, I need to understand if I'm capturing significant information that can give me insightful information at the end of the day. And when I say that, I don't mean I just want to capture the data regarding to my impact. I also want to capture data regarding my internal operations. Although that data would come in from individual departments, I need to keep in mind that I want them to be connected somehow. Because, at the end of the day, I might want to know that how many of my volunteers are actually my donors, or my donors become my volunteers, something of that sort, right? Because it helps me focus my energy towards a specific sector. So I want my data to be, aligned together. I want it to be connected somehow. So in designing, I'm thinking about my data points. I'm thinking about what sort of data points would come in from different departments, and how do I connect these data points so that I give a common story, a complete story, rather than giving a siloed one, right? And that's how my data design has to go about. Now, the next step is the data collection procedure, and I talked about it a little bit in my last conversation with you about what is the mechanism around data collection, right? How am I collecting my data? I need to define my process of collection of data, right? If it's a survey-based data, if it's through an application, or if it's like a conversation like you and me are having right now, is it a semi-structured interviews? How am I collecting that data? And what sort of mechanism am I using to collect that data, right? Because it's very important to know, once I have this collection mechanism, I can work around towards transforming it. I can work towards using it in a way that is more significant to the output, right? Because if I'm collecting a survey based data, I understand there are going to be biases. I understand there is a liability on me to set up those questions in a way that they are not biased. So, and if if the data is coming through an application, so I know that the application data would considerably less biased than my survey data. So, there are certain things that have to be kept in mind when deciding a collection mechanism. And that's why you need to define these processes. And also in this collection process, you need to define what is the interval that you're going to collect this data in, right? How many times are you going to collect this data? Who is your audience? How many stakeholders are there, right? Your funders might want to look at specific data points. At the same time, the organizations might want to look at specific data points. So again, keeping all of these points in mind, you have to design your data collection in that sense. Now, the next phase would be the actual data set, right? I have defined what data points coming from impact, what data points are coming from my internal operations. Now, where does all of this data go, right? My internal operations data might be coming in Excel. My survey data might be coming in, Google Forms or paper-based, or I don't know, some Q Pro, Qualtrics, or whatever. How is all of this coming together and making it complete, right? Defining where will all of this data sit? Will it sit in some sort of a database? Will it sit in, Google Drive? I don't know. So defining these processes, and that is an answer that will be customized to each organization, right? So defining that is very important, again, because the security measures would be different. The skill set required for managing such a database or a data set would be different. So understanding who is managing it, how are you doing it, where are you keeping it, what sort of security premises are set in place. So that is the phase in the data set phase, right? That's what we're talking about in the data set phase. And next is the data structure. And when I'm talking about data structure, I'm actually talking in terms of realizing if my data is clean, right? What do I mean by data is clean? So if I have a specific data point, like I'm collecting date as a data point, I want to make sure that the date is in a common format in my data set. I want to make sure that if it's in MMYYDD, it's all of that is consistent throughout. I don't want YYMMDD in some other cell, right? Similarly, I don't want to see if a column is collecting all the numerical data. I don't want to see a character data in that, right? Second thing I want to check in this data is for data duplication. I don't want same data to come again and again, because ultimately the analysis is getting biased if I have duplication of the data, right? Third thing is managing my, what we generally use in the data terms is null values, right? Which values that are not there, or basically not applicable, not defined, right? Or empty. So you can define null in multiple ways. So how do I manage my null values, right? Because if I perform an aggregate function on a column which has null values, that will not give me a result. So specific softwares might by ignoring it, but specific software might give me an error. So I need to manage my null values. How do I use it? How do I work around it? So realizing all of that comes in the data structure. Where I'm looking at my duplication, where I'm looking at how do I manage my null values, and how if my data is consistent throughout each column, basically the formatting of the data, right? And then comes the data analysis and the insight part, right? Although people might say the data analysis and insights are two different things, but for the sake of this discussion, I'm considering that both of them in the same bucket. And that is primarily because at the end of the day, I'm thinking of a common report, right? At the end of the day, that goes out. And what I want from that is to see the data points or see the insights that I can use to make decisions. It can be in form of analysis, it can be in form of insights, right? So in this stage, I'm looking at what sort of output am I showing to my audience? Am I performing statistical analysis? Am I just creating charts and showing it to my audience? And when I'm performing statistics, I need to keep in mind that the statistics that I'm performing, I put it in a way that everyone is able to understand it, right? Not everyone in this world is a statistician or is comfortable with numbers. So it has to be put it in a way that everyone understands that. So making sure that there's a person who realizes that and can work around with that, right? In the data insight phase, I'm thinking more towards the data visualization, right? In terms of visualization, the person, or we talked about in data readiness the skill set, and that's where your skill set comes in. How do you use that data? What sort of charts do you create? Do you understand the difference between stacked bar chart and normal bar chart? When do you use stacked bar chart? When do you use pie chart? Why not to use stacked bar chart? All of these questions are very important, because at the end of the day, you don't want your readers to be like, what is that? Like, what does that imply? I don't understand that. I need some text underneath. And the whole idea behind putting in graphs and charts is that the representation of the data becomes easier, right? And if the reader still has to go and look for explanation on the chart itself, that makes a job redundant. So understanding how you're presenting your data, figuring out the data points that you need, figuring out how do you represent that data, all of that comes in the data analysis and insight phase, right? Now, the final one is data driven decision making, right? And anyone would think that, okay, fine, we have reached this phase now. We have done all of this. We have created the structure, we have performed the analysis, we have gotten the data insight. Now, it's data driven decision making. Perfect. I can make my decisions. I don't have to talk about it, right? But it's not that straightforward, right? If I see from my charts and analysis that 50% of the population is doing great in a specific program, what does that imply, right? And a basic understanding would be like, okay, this program is doing significant, I mean, okay, right? But how do you generalize that across the population? When I say 50%, does that signify that 50% of the population? Or does that mean 50% of a specific area of people are doing better? Right? And that needs to be understood by looking at the sample size, first of all. Right? These are the parameters that you need to keep in mind when you're reading the data, when you're making decisions. What is the sample size? What is the distribution of the data, right? Fine, forget it. That if I'm saying 50%, it can be out of like calculated out of 10 people. That's a very small size. I can't generalize it to anything, right? But if I say forget about it, it's not 10, it's 100, right? But again, in 100, the data sample is divided as such that 80% of the people out of this 100 are from specific village, while the 20% are from the other village. So if the insight shows me 50% improvement in the domain, does does that signify that 80% village population is over signifying something, and the 80% is getting marginalized? Probably yes. So these are things that I need to keep in mind, right? It's similar to me asking you, like, if I flip a coin, right, what is the probability of a heads, right? What is the 50-50, right? That's exactly what you would say. So if I take a coin right now and flip it 10 times, right, I don't expect it to come like 5 times head, 5 times tails. And why is that? The reason behind that is probability in all is based on performing a specific action infinite number of times, right? The idea is if I flip a coin infinite number of times, there's a high chance that heads will come 50% of the times, tails will come 50% of the time, right? And that's why people say that there's more data, better the accuracy. But again, we will never reach there, right? We can never collect all the data about a population and forget about it. We reached there. We collected all the data about the population. But at the end of the day, there are biases in the data collection mechanism, in the data entering procedures. So we need to understand there is always some sort of this error percentage when we are doing any sort of analysis. The analysis is not 100% accurate all the time. That's it. That is the reason when a person is making decisions, they need to keep in mind that this data is generalizable to an extent. It's not short, and that's why we need to think about this process even in the data driven decision making process, right? So I talked about defining goals, creating objectives, creating data design, and then data collection mechanism, the actual data set, where it sits, all of that, data structure, and then data analysis, data insight, and then your data driven decision making. These are the 8 steps that one can use to evaluate themselves, where they are, where are the gap points, and specifically focus on which is the weak area for them. In order to further advance that, a person can even rate them on all of these stages and understand what is their data readiness score overall. If I mean Yeah, that's a discussion for later time probably, but yeah, this is a kind of framework that organizations can use to better relate uh, where they lie on the data readiness journey. Yeah.
Thank you so much for listening into our conversation, and we look forward to seeing you at the next virtual learning lab. Thank you.